Hey guys, how you going? So today on BKRsport, we are back for part number 3, episode number 3 of The Last Dance. This is a series on Netflix revolving around the 97-98 Chicago Bulls. Well, actually, not even really just the 97-98 Chicago Bulls. It really is basically about the whole organization and how the Michael Jordan era came apart and came about. Literally came apart and also came about. But it obviously does focus specifically around the 97-98 Chicago Bulls season, where they were going for their 6th title in 8 years and a back-to-back. We do reactions to each episode, so if you haven't seen parts 1 and part 2, definitely go and check those out, because obviously the first one is really kind of setting up this whole series, and the second one was all about Scottie Pippen, who was, you know, the right-hand man to Michael. And I'm really excited to talk about this one today because so far it's actually been my favorite episode. It's been my favorite episode, this one revolving around Denis Rodman, the really interesting character that is Denis Rodman. As you guys are aware, I'm quite young and a relatively new basketball fan as well from Australia, so I wasn't around during these times. I wasn't aware of during these times. I obviously knew about Jordan and Scottie Pippen and the Bulls of this time, but I wasn't actually fully aware of the situation, aware what's going on, and this is a really interesting series for me to watch because it really gives an in-depth look into what was going on to a championship winning team, what goes on behind the scenes, and the organizational structure that really does get a lot of focus on, that shows the off-court situation. And as we heard Denis Rodman at the end say, basically, you know, he would go out there and play the basketball for free, right? He'd go out there and play the basketball for free, but the pay actually comes from the shit that you cop outside of on the court. You know, off the court is where you actually get your money's worth. And I can understand that because obviously the media speculation, the media shit, the media talk this and that and this and that. So I get what he's saying. He loves the game of basketball. He really wants to play the game of basketball, and he'd play for free, to be honest, but he does want the money to deal with the shit that goes on behind the scenes and off the court itself. But this episode was absolutely fantastic, so let's get talking about it. This is The Last Dance, episode 3. To open this up, I want to bring up a quote that was said by Denis Rodman at the beginning, and this isn't just something that I've been focusing on and listening to in the recent episodes, or even this series in general, or even basketball. I've been really kind of taking note of this throughout the last couple of years in all different sports, and it doesn't really get the light that it probably deserves. It doesn't really probably get the light that it deserves. The quote was from Rodman saying, "People see what they see on the court and think, God, he's a bad person." That's pretty deep, you know. People actually genuinely believe that the persona that you hold on the court or in sport in general, not even just basketball, but the persona that you put into your game, the type of playing style you play with, the aggression, in Rodman's stance, the aggression, the dominance, the hard-nosed defender, people see him in that light. They see him as this person outside of the game too. It's like, obviously, because that's all they see. They only see that part, so they're like, okay, he must be a dickhead. But in reality, there's a whole different part to this person off the court that is absolutely nothing like that. And as you guys know, I have a sports podcast called In the Shed, where we get the players on, and we had Charlie Dixon from the AFL, Port Adelaide, the other week. And basically, he's in the exact same situation. Like, he gets messages or comments from people saying, wow, you're actually a nice guy. Like, wow, I never would have picked you to be a nice guy from what I've seen on the field. It's just like, well, you know, it's just like, obviously these guys are playing the game to win, you know. Obviously these guys are doing their best to win, and their playing style, I get you don't like it, but if you're a fan of that team, you like it. If you're a fan of the team they're playing for, you like it. But when they're not playing for your team, you don't like it, because they're obviously trying to beat your team. But that doesn't mean necessarily that person is like that off the court, you know. That's the whole point, and that's the whole meaning of, you know, once the game finishes, usually guys go up and shake the hand, or, you know, go have a beer, or go have a drink, or chill out and have a laugh, you know. It's just all part of the game. And people fail to understand that there is one personality on the court, and there is one personality when they're not playing. And this is really pivotal in this episode, because Denis Rodman obviously has polar opposite personalities from court to in real life. And I know about Denis Rodman. I've always known about Denis Rodman. I knew he was a part of that era. I always knew he was like the third wheel, the third man in that team behind Pippen and Michael Jordan. But I never knew his personality. I never knew the interesting character that this man was. But in reality, obviously everyone thinks of him as that third wheel, but without that third wheel, it doesn't keep going. You know, the wheels don't keep flowing. Like, he is a very important wheel. He is a very important part of the process of the Chicago Bulls. He is just as important as Michael Jordan and Pippen. Obviously, he has a different role to play. He isn't the star player getting smacking buckets, you know, getting 40, 50 points a game, you know, being the star of the team, which is Michael Jordan. He doesn't have the role of being the second man in charge, which he actually did eventually, which we'll get into in a second. He didn't need to be the second in charge that dominates the ball and is able to score, but kind of just, you know, helps out Michael Jordan and help Jordan basically be the best man that he can be. Dennis Rodman was an absolute phenomenal defender. You know, he was a phenomenal, hard-nosed defender, and we definitely don't see any players like him in the game today, because back then, obviously, you could basically murder someone on the court and you'd probably get away with it. He was the grinder behind the scenes, and you need those grinders, and he didn't want, well, I don't know if he wanted the limelight or not. I kind of am confused on that. At some points, he alludes to the fact that he doesn't want the limelight. He just wants to be kind of that third man doing his job, having a good time, basically. And then at other points, he does seem like he really does want that limelight. And as we see when, you know, Pippen, as we spoke about in the second episode, when he goes down injured and his whole contract issues, Rodman had to jump into that second in charge role with Pippen being down. So, you know, he did enjoy that. He did enjoy that. And obviously afterwards he kind of fell off when Pippen came back. But I am very confused whether he actually did enjoy the limelight and did want to be more than a third wheel. And then at other times I was like, you know, yeah, he's happy. He's fine being that third wheel, that grinder behind the scenes. I tell you what though, something that I did notice, and this is something that I'm not going to really talk about too much, but Michael Jordan doesn't even really refer to his other teammates. He only really refers to Pippen and Rodman. Although the episodes have focused around Scottie Pippen and Denis Rodman, the point of the matter is that whenever there is a player that gets referred to, they're kind of referred to as nobodies, like someone who was just there and needed to be there, but they're just kind of there. Now, referring to Dennis himself, he had a very difficult upbringing. I find that a lot of players in basketball specifically come from this kind of scenario. I find that basketball was a streets game, and that's not meaning to be a negative in any way. I just find that there is a lot more of these kind of stories from basketball, and from my experience in America, I just feel like basketball is this type of game where, you know, even if you have nothing, you have absolutely nothing in your life, as long as somebody in your neighborhood has a ball, they're playing down at the court. And you can just go down there and play, and it's rough. It's damn well rough, and you get beat up. That's kind of what the feeling I get about the basketball era of I don't know, 2000 and the 2010s really. 2000s are probably still pretty hard-nosed, but nowadays it's not as hard-nosed. There is some points, but not really. So although Rodman got kicked out of his home and was basically couch surfing for 2-3 years, like he said, it's still always that ability to go down and to practice and to play and to really grind. And I guess that separates the guys who get into the drug scene, which Rodman says that he didn't get into, which is phenomenal considering his whole life was in that, I don't know what, street scene. I'll call it street scene, not gangster or hood. It's fantastic to see that he didn't get into the drugs, and although you look at him and you're just like, well, your kind of personality makes me think that you do acid, but in the same sense, it's like, I don't know. He might have got into it later in life, but he did say when he was growing up that he wasn't into the drug scene, and I can believe that because, you know, he doesn't really have anything to lie about. Then we moved to the 80s where he got drafted, I think, with the 27th pick. I think it was the 27th pick that they said, and, you know, that's still pretty high. Nowadays, that's still first round. I don't know how many teams there were back then, however. I don't know how many teams there were back then. Obviously, there have been teams that have been included since. Going to the Detroit Pistons. Now, I was vaguely, briefly, somewhat aware of the hard-nosed tactics of the Detroit Pistons of the early years, but I was nowhere near up to date with how physical they were, nowhere near up to date with their absolute tormenting of the opposition on the court. It was actually, like, watching the shit they did back then, like, now you get a bloody you get flagrants everywhere. Flagrants, your whole team, you're done. The whole team is done. Like, it's mad what they could get away with back then. Like, they could basically beat you up on the court and get away with it. Like, it's as simple as that. That's literally what the Detroit Pistons did, and they owned that. They owned that thought process. They owned that mentality. And they literally did it to Michael Jordan in the final series. I think it was 1989, I believe it was, the final series with Michael Jordan, and they literally beat him up on the court because they knew that the only way to beat Michael was to put him in the ICU, basically, the intensive care unit. It's just, it's ridiculous. ridiculous what they could get away with back then. And like I said, they owned it. They loved it. They wanted to be these bad boys. And they said in there that they actually wanted to be the bad boys of this reputation. And they were absolutely living it up. And that's why they were so successful, because they just didn't give a shit what you think. They just didn't give a shit what the media said. You know, they wanted to live it up. They wanted to be the team that everyone hated. And they were good at it. And they were fantastic at it. And that's why they're known as one of the greatest teams. It was also great hearing about Doug Collins and his rise and his relationship with Michael Jordan, and the way that he was able to bring out the best in him. He was able to make him the MVP. He was able to bring him out as the all-star MVP. I think he was the defensive player of the year as well. And just the whole league was very defensive minded. So it was fantastic to see that Michael Jordan, you know, was defensive player of the year in that time. And he was also the slam dunk champion. So it really, obviously, Doug Collins deserves a lot of credit for bringing him out of his shell, bringing Michael Jordan out of his shell. And the relationship they had was unreal. It was unreal to see as a player-coach relationship. At some point, we're about to see him get fired, obviously, or leave, because, you know, Phil Jackson does come in. But I think that Doug Collins was 100% necessary to the puzzle. And without Doug Collins, this puzzle doesn't really probably come to light. He really built the team out of that Chicago mind frame of, like, you know, we're going to lose this game, or we're going to choke this lead, or we can't hit that buzzer beater win. And I feel like Game 5 of the series against, I believe it was Cleveland, so I was about to say Indiana, but Cleveland, Game 5 of the series, and Michael Jordan goes and hits the buzzer beater to beat the Cleveland Cavaliers and prove all the haters wrong. That was probably the game that changed the outset for the Chicago Bulls. That was the game that took them to the next level. Then we push forward a few years and go back to Rodman into the mid-90s, and it's just so sad to see, you know, the struggles that you can clearly see and understand that this man has. Like, you look into his eyes and you can just see he's got so much going on, whether it be mentally or just kind of what's going on in his life and his situation, his upbringing, and you can just, it's so sad. You can see the sadness in his eyes, and he just gets by really at this point. And you know, he loves playing the game of basketball. You know, he did contemplate suicide, and apparently if he didn't fall asleep and the police found him in his car with a shotgun or a gun beside him, probably would have. But that's incredibly sad to see, because you think of these guys who achieved their dream and they're playing, you know, the top tier basketball of the world in the NBA for the Detroit Pistons, who are a fantastic team. And yet these guys still have all these issues, and it really drives home the effect that no matter how successful you are still going to have problems. You're still going to face problems. This then forced him out of Detroit. He went to San Antonio, eventually obviously coming to the Chicago Bulls. But the move from Detroit really paved his way to being his own man and being himself. I don't believe he could have been himself if he was in Detroit, because it's such a, it was the mindset, the mentality. That's why obviously he basically got kicked out and moved on from Detroit, because of his issues and problems. But being away from Detroit, he was able to really open up, and then he, you know, got with Madonna. You know, fantastic, well done, champion. Helped him to come out of his shell, and then he was wearing all these hats and lipstick and piercings and eyeshadow, and very interesting character. And it really paved the way for people to realize that you don't have to give a shit what people think. You know, don't give a shit what people think. It's all about you. You know, if you're happy, that's fine. It doesn't matter about what these other people say. It's not about what the media says. As long as you're happy, it's okay. And I feel like that's a big takeaway from this series so far, is that Rodman really paved the way for not to giving a shit about what other people think. The early years with Rodman at the Bulls was probably where I get the feeling he was happy to be the third wheel. I feel like he was adjusting, he was doing his own thing, he was being his own man, and I think he was happy being that guy who was helping out Pippen and Jordan, and I think he was very happy and content with being that third wheel. But when Pippen's contract issues and injury happened, which we spoke about in the last episode, he was forced to emerge as that second man behind Jordan, and I think he really relished this. And you know, when he did stand up, he was fantastic and he was doing really well, and you know, he was really helping out the team, and the results started to show from it that he was just, you know, he became the old Rodman, because he did kind of go a few years where he was just getting by and doing his thing. But when Pippen was out, it forced him to stand up as that second man. And I think he really enjoyed this. I think he really enjoyed the fact of the limelight, and I don't think he really understood or imagined that he would enjoy the limelight until it actually happened. Because like I said, he was very content until he was forced to emerge. And then when Pippen came back, which I personally believe, he says it was because he didn't want the Bulls to benefit from the situation and get their fines and him lose money and whatnot. You know, that's fine, that's well and good. But I personally believe that he came back because he saw that Rodman was taking his limelight, and he was seeing that Rodman was able to do his job well, and they were doing the job well without Pippen. So I think he needed to come back to really assert his dominance and show that he is that second man in charge. And, you know, Rodman, I love you, but, you know, I kind of feel like there was a little bit of competition between the two for Jordan's love, for Jordan's friendship as the right-hand man. And although Pippen won that battle in the end, because, you know, there's no Michael Jordan without Scottie Pippen, I just think there was more of an underlying tone that there was this competition between the two. And I don't know if we'll find out a little bit more about that later, but I feel like there was a real underlying tone where these guys were very competitive for the love of Michael Jordan. And then from there, Dennis really fell off the wagon a little bit. You know, he went back to that third wheel and third man in charge. And although, you know, you should be loving being a part of that situation, you know, he obviously realized there was more to it. He was having a lot of fun as that second man, and unfortunately with Pippen coming back, it forced him back into his role, and I guess he just didn't cope with it too well. But that is going to do us for today, guys. I really do hope you are enjoying this series. If you are enjoying it, please give it a big thumbs up so that I know you're loving it, I know you want more, and I know you want more documentary reviews in the future, because there are plenty of other sporting documentaries that I can watch, and I've already got a couple that are ready to go after this, but there is still a whole 7 episodes left of this series. I'm so looking forward to how this series finishes up. We are very well aware that the Chicago Bulls win this season, but it's the process of getting there and the difficulties they're facing throughout this season, which is really intriguing, really interesting. And I feel like even if you're not a basketball fan, and especially like myself, who wasn't around those times and didn't know about those times, but know of those times, it is an incredible series that really is defining the entire structure of an organization rather than on the court. If you do love your sport, guys, definitely hit the subscribe button below, join the BK Army, and go and hit the little ding-a-ling-a-ling notification bell so you get a notification every single time we upload. And that's going to do it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Catch you later. See ya.